The night they humiliated me was the same night everything changed. They thought they had finally put me in my place. But none of them knew that in a few minutes, the most powerful man in the room was about to say my name. The ballroom glittered with crystal lights and expensive smiles. The annual industry awards were the biggest event of the year. CEOs, investors, media, everyone who mattered was there. And of course, my family too. The Khan family had built one of the largest business empires in the region. At least, that's what the world believed. When I arrived at the venue, wearing a simple black suit, my older cousin Hamza spotted me first, his lips curled into a smirk. "Well, look who decided to show up," he said loudly, making sure the people around him could hear. "I thought you'd be too busy doing whatever it is you do these days." A few of my relatives chuckled. My aunt gave me that familiar disappointed look. "Your seat isn't with us," she said coldly. "The main family table is full." I glanced at the large round table in the center of the hall where my father, uncles, and cousins were sitting like royalty. There were clearly empty chairs, but they had already decided. A waiter stepped forward awkwardly. "Sir, your seat is over there." He pointed to the far corner of the hall, at a small table, with the interns. A group of young employees looked at me nervously as I walked toward them. I could feel dozens of eyes watching, whispering, "Isn't that Mr. Kareem's younger son? I heard he failed in business. They say the family cut him off." I sat quietly while my cousins at the main table laughed and took photos for the cameras. They loved this moment. For years, they had treated me like the family's biggest embarrassment because I didn't follow their rules, because I walked away from the company, and because they believed I had nothing left. One of the interns beside me leaned closer and whispered kindly, "I'm sorry, sir. This must feel uncomfortable." I smiled slightly. "It's fine," I said. But inside, memories were rising like a storm. The day my father told me I would never succeed without the family name. The day my cousins laughed when my startup failed. The day they forced me out of the company boardroom like I was a stranger. That humiliation had followed me for years. But humiliation can be a powerful teacher. Across the ballroom, my cousin Hamza lifted his glass toward me mockingly, like he was celebrating a victory. He had no idea how wrong he was. The music slowly faded as the host walked onto the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced with excitement, "it is time for the final award of the night." The entire hall quieted. "This award will be presented by the chairman of the Global Investment Group, the man whose investments have shaped industries across the world." People straightened in their chairs. The chairman was a legend in the business world. If he backed a company, its value exploded overnight. The host continued, "Please welcome Mr. Adrian Cole." Applause filled the ballroom as the tall, silver-haired chairman walked onto the stage. At the main table, my father leaned forward with interest. Hamza whispered something to him, clearly excited. They were hoping their company would be mentioned tonight. Mr. Cole adjusted the microphone and looked slowly across the crowd. "For the past year," he began calmly, "our firm has been searching for the most innovative new company in the region." The screen behind him lit up with charts and headlines about a mysterious startup that had disrupted several major markets. Whispers spread across the room. "That company is worth billions now, but nobody knows who the founder is." Mr. Cole smiled slightly. "This company started with almost nothing. No famous family, no powerful connections." My cousins at the main table looked relaxed again. That definitely wasn't them. Mr. Cole continued. "But what impressed us most was the mind behind it." He paused, and then he said something that made the entire room go silent. "Tonight, I would like to introduce the founder of that company, a young man who built it from the ground up." Cameras turned toward the stage. My family leaned forward eagerly. "And I'm proud to say he's here tonight." Mr. Cole slowly looked across the ballroom. His eyes stopped, right at my table, right where I was sitting among the interns. Then he smiled and raised his hand, pointing directly at me. "Please stand up." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. The entire ballroom turned to look at the corner table. Hundreds of eyes moved in the same direction toward me. The interns sitting beside me looked confused. One of them even turned around to see if the chairman was pointing at someone behind us, but there was no one else. My cousin Hamza laughed loudly from the main table. "Who is he pointing at?" he whispered to the others. Then the chairman spoke again. "Yes, you. Please stand up." A strange silence filled the hall. My heart was calm, but the room felt like it had stopped breathing. Slowly, I pushed my chair back and stood up. Gasps spread across the crowd. At the main table, my father's face froze. My uncle leaned closer to him and whispered something urgently. Hamza's smile slowly disappeared. The chairman looked pleased. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "this is the man behind Nexora Technologies." The giant screen behind him suddenly changed. A sleek logo appeared. Nexora, along with headlines from major financial newspaper. I envy stars Kelnisher of THIND. Murmurs filled the room. "That's him." "No way, that's Kareem Khan's younger son. I thought he was a failure." The chairman continued speaking, his voice steady. 3 years ago, this young man walked into our office with nothing but a small presentation and an idea everyone else had rejected. I slowly began walking toward the stage. Every step felt like it echoed through the ballroom. As I passed the main family table, I noticed something I'd never seen before. Silence, no mocking smiles, no whispers, only shock. Hamza stared at me like he was looking at a ghost. My father couldn't even meet my eyes. The chairman continued. Most investors laughed at his proposal. They said it was too risky, too ambitious. He smiled slightly, but I saw something different. I saw someone who had already survived failure and turned it into fuel. I stepped onto the stage beside him. Cameras flashed everywhere. The chairman placed a hand on my shoulder. This company, he said proudly, he's now valued at over $3 billion. The room exploded with noise. People started whispering loudly, some even clapping in disbelief. I looked across the ballroom. My relatives sat frozen at their table. The same people who once said I would never succeed without the family company. The chairman handed me the microphone. "Would you like to say something?" he asked. I held the microphone for a moment without speaking. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I was remembering something. The last family board meeting I had attended. 3 years earlier, I could still hear my cousin Hamza's voice. "You think you're smarter than everyone here? Go build your own company if you're so confident." The room had laughed that day, even my father. "You'll come crawling back in 6 months," one of my uncles had said. I slowly looked toward their table again. Now the laughter was gone. My father finally looked up at me. His expression was complicated, pride mixed with something else. Regret. I turned back to the audience and finally spoke. 3 years ago, I walked away from my family's company. The room went quiet again. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I was told I didn't belong there. I could feel my cousins shifting in their seats. Some of the guests started glancing toward the Khan family table. I was told I didn't understand business, that I was too naive, too inexperienced. I paused, and maybe at that time they were right. A few people in the audience nodded. Failure stories were common in business, but I continued. So I left with nothing but an idea, and a lot of people who believed I would fail. The chairman smiled beside me. "But sometimes," I said quietly, "failure is just the beginning of a better story." More applause started building. Across the ballroom, I noticed my cousin Hamza whispering angrily to my uncle. They were clearly uncomfortable now. But the real moment was still coming. I took a slow breath. "There's one more thing I want to say tonight." The audience leaned in. Even the media cameras moved closer. I looked directly at the main family table again. The same table where they had refused to let me sit earlier that evening. "Earlier tonight," I continued calmly, "I was seated with the interns." A few people laughed softly, but honestly, I didn't mind. I glanced back at the interns' table and smiled, because they reminded me of something important. The room waited for my next words. They reminded me of what it feels like to start from the bottom. The chairman nodded in approval, and sometimes the people sitting at the smallest tables end up building the biggest companies. Applause broke out again, but at the Khan family table, no one clapped. My cousin Hamza looked furious. My father still hadn't spoken. Then the chairman leaned closer to me and quietly said something into the microphone that the entire room could hear. "And I believe," he said, "this is only the beginning of his story." He turned slightly toward me. "Tell them what happens next." I looked at him for a moment, then back at the audience, and finally back at the table where my family sat, because the next thing I was about to reveal was the one thing none of them were prepared to hear. The room had gone so quiet that even the sound of the cameras clicking felt loud. I looked at the faces in front of me, investors, CEOs, reporters, and people who had spent years watching the rise and fall of businesses. But my eyes stopped at one table. The Khan family table. My family. My father sat still, his hands folded on the table. My uncle looked nervous, and Hamza looked like he was trying to understand what was happening. For years they had believed one thing, that I needed them. That without the family company, I was nothing. I took a slow breath and looked back at the audience. When I started my company, I said calmly, I had 2 choices. The room stayed silent. I could build something small, something safe, something that wouldn't threaten anyone. A few people nodded. That would have been easy. I paused. But I chose something different. On the giant screen behind me, a new slide suddenly appeared. A chart that showed market share across the entire industry. Most of the audience leaned forward, because at the top of the chart were 2 names. The first one was familiar to everyone, Khan Global Industries, my family's company, and directly under it, Nexera Technologies. A wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. The distance between the 2 companies was small. Very small. I continued speaking. For the last 3 years, Nexera hasn't just been growing. I looked at my family again. It has been competing. The whispers became louder. Across the room, investors started checking the numbers on their phones. Everyone in the industry knew the truth. Khan Global Industries had been losing market share recently, slowly, quietly, but no one knew who was taking it, until now. Hamza suddenly stood up from his chair. "That's impossible," he said loudly. A few people turned to look at him. My uncle tried to pull him back down, but Hamza didn't sit. "You're lying," he said again, his voice tense. "Our company has contracts locked for the next 5 years." I didn't react. Instead, I looked at the chairman. He smiled calmly. Then he nodded toward the screen technician. Another slide appeared. This one showed something very specific. 3 major contracts. Contracts that had once belonged to Con Global Industries. But now, they belong to Nexora. The crowd gasped. Even the reporters started whispering excitedly. Hamza's face turned pale. You? He said slowly, looking at me. You were the one. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I spoke to the entire room. Business isn't personal. I said quietly. It's about ideas, innovation, and the ability to move forward when others refuse to change. The chairman folded his arms, clearly enjoying the moment. But sometimes, I continued, people make it personal first. I could see my father watching me carefully now, not with anger. With curiosity, I stepped slightly closer to the edge of the stage. 3 years ago, I presented an idea to the board of Con Global Industries. My uncle suddenly looked uncomfortable. You remember that meeting? I said while looking directly at him. He didn't respond, but the audience was completely silent now. The idea was simple. I continued. A new technology platform that would completely change how the industry operates. I let the word settle in the air, but the board rejected it. Some people in the crowd shook their heads slightly. Rejecting innovation was a dangerous move in business. They said it was unrealistic. I added, too expensive, too risky. I smiled faintly, so I built it myself. A new wave of applause started, but it quickly faded as everyone realized what that meant. If Nexora had built that platform, then the entire industry was about to change. I turned my head and looked at my father. For years, people told me I needed the family name to succeed. He slowly stood from his chair. The entire room watched him. He didn't look angry. He looked thoughtful. You proved them wrong, he said quietly. The microphone on the stage caught his voice. Some of the audience gasped because hearing the founder of Con Global Industries admit that publicly was shocking. Hamza looked at him in disbelief. Uncle, you can't be serious, he said quickly. But my father ignored him. His eyes stayed on me. I underestimated you, he said. For a moment, the years of tension between us filled the room, but I didn't respond yet. Instead, I turned back toward the audience. There's one more announcement tonight, I said. The chairman raised an eyebrow because even he hadn't expected that. The audience leaned forward again. What announcement? Someone whispered. I looked at the screen technician again. The next slide appeared. This one showed something very different, a corporate acquisition document. At the top of the page were the words SKGBUU PARO PAO SL. The room exploded with murmurs. Investors started talking loudly to each other. Acquisitions in this industry were rare and usually massive. The chairman looked at me with surprise. You didn't mention this to me, he said quietly. I smiled slightly. It was finalized this afternoon. Now, even he looked curious. I turned back to the audience. Nexora Technologies has reached a point where expansion is necessary, I said calmly. The slide zoomed in on the proposal, but the name of the company being acquired was still blurred. The suspense in the room grew stronger. Everyone wanted to know the same thing. Which company? Which company was Nexora planning to buy? Investors whispered predictions. Some mentioned smaller firms. Others guessed international competitors. But at the Khan family table, something else was happening. My cousin Hamza was staring at the screen. And slowly his face started losing color because he had noticed something. The shape of the logo under the blur. It looked familiar, very familiar. He stood up again, this time much more slowly. No, he whispered. My uncle leaned toward him. What is it? He asked. Hamza didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the screen because he was beginning to understand something the rest of the room hadn't realized yet. And if he was right, then the next words I spoke would change everything for the Khan family. I lifted the microphone again. The entire ballroom waited, and then I said, tonight Nexora is making an offer to acquire. The entire ballroom leaned forward. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the reporters stopped typing. Tonight, I repeated slowly, Nexora is making an offer to acquire. I paused. Across the room, Hamza looked like he had already figured it out. His lips moved, but no words came out. My uncle shook his head. That's impossible, he whispered. My father remained silent, watching me carefully. The screen behind me changed, the blur slowly faded, and then the Neagalabial industrialized. For a moment, it felt like the entire room forgot how to breathe. Then chaos exploded. What? That's his family's company. He's trying to buy his own family business. Investors stood up from their chairs. Reporters rushed closer to the stage. Phones came out everywhere. At the family table, Hamza slammed his hand on the table. This is a joke, he shouted. My uncle looked furious. You think you can walk in here and humiliate us like this? He yelled. But my father didn't say anything. He kept staring at the screen because he understood something the others didn't. This wasn't a joke. This was real. I spoke calmly into the microphone. For years, Con Global Industries dominated this market, I said, but in the last 3 years, the world has changed. The charts behind me updated again. Revenue decline, lost contracts, falling market value. The room filled with uncomfortable murmurs. Everyone in the industry already knew the company had been struggling, but seeing the numbers publicly was different. Hamza looked furious. You caused this? He shouted at me. I met his eyes. No, I said calmly. Innovation caused it. The chairman beside me crossed his arms, watching everything closely. I continued. 3 years ago, I brought the future of this industry to the boardroom. I looked at my uncle. You rejected it. Then I looked at Hamza. You laughed at it. The silence grew heavier. And now, I said quietly, that same idea has built one of the fastest growing companies in the world. The screen switched again. Nexora's valuation appeared. $3 billion. A wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Then the acquisition number appeared underneath. An offer large enough to completely take control of Con Global Industries. Gasps filled the ballroom. My uncle stood up angrily. You think we would sell our company to you? He snapped. This company was built by our family. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. Was. Then I looked directly at my father, but the family stopped listening. That sentence hit the room like a stone, because everyone could feel the truth behind it. My father finally stood up. The room went quiet again. He walked slowly away from the family table and toward the stage. Every step felt heavy. Hamza spoke quickly. Uncle, don't even listen to this. He's trying to embarrass us. But my father ignored him. He walked all the way to the front of the stage. Then he looked up at me. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said something no one expected. You built all of this without us. His voice wasn't angry. It was almost proud. Yes, I replied. The room watched us like it was the final scene of a movie. My father nodded slowly. I remember that meeting 3 years ago, he said. He looked at the audience. My son presented an idea that could have changed everything. His eyes moved toward my uncle and Hamza. But we were too arrogant to see it. Hamza shook his head. You can't be serious, he said. My father turned toward him. This company was supposed to be about vision, he said firmly, not ego. Hamza didn't respond, because for the first time in his life, he had lost. My father turned back to me. And now you want to buy the company, he said. Yes, I answered. Why, he asked. You already beat us. I held the microphone for a moment before replying. Because revenge was never the goal. The room grew quiet again. I didn't build Nexora to destroy the family company. I continued. I built it to prove something. The chairman smiled slightly beside me. I looked at my father. I wanted to prove that ideas matter more than names. My father nodded slowly. Then he asked the question everyone was thinking. So what happens if we accept this offer? I looked out across the room. At Nexora, innovation comes first. I said, the company will be rebuilt. New leadership, new technology. My eyes moved briefly toward Hamza. But the old way of doing things will end. The meaning was clear. Some people at the family table looked uncomfortable. Hamza looked furious. You planned this from the beginning, he said. No. I replied calmly. You planned it for me. The crowd reacted with quiet murmurs, because everyone understood that sentence. Hamza and the others had pushed me out. They had created the competitor who now stood above them. My father sighed softly. Then he looked up at me again. When you walked away 3 years ago, he said, I thought you would fail. I know, I replied. He smiled slightly. I've never been happier to be wrong. The room applauded, but the biggest moment came next. My father turned toward the audience. Then he said clearly, Can Global Industries accepts the offer? The ballroom erupted. Reporters rushed to the stage. Cameras flashed like lightning. The chairman leaned toward me. Well, he said quietly, that's one way to make an entrance. I laughed softly. Across the room, Hamza sat back down slowly, defeated. For years, he had believed power came from the family name. Tonight, he learned something different. Power comes from vision. My father stepped onto the stage beside me. For the first time in years, he placed his hand on my shoulder. Congratulations, he said. I looked at the crowd filling the ballroom, the same people who had watched me sit at the interns table only an hour earlier. Funny how quickly things change. I remembered the interns sitting quietly in the corner, the smallest table in the room, and I smiled, because sometimes the people sitting at the smallest tables really do end up building the biggest empires.